camera lens flickers, capturing a performance so raw it feels visceral. In a low-budget horror film, the lead actress screams, pulling a trigger in a choreographed dance of death. But as the director calls cut, a terrifying reality emerges from the shadows of the editing room. Months earlier, this same woman stood in a sun-drenched kitchen holding a real weapon, watching her own uncle's life slip away. This wasn't method acting. It was the digital blueprint of a murder. That had already happened. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Born into a family that prized the written word, Aisling grew up under the shadow of her mother, Kelly Moore, a successful author and journalist who had once chronicled the high-stakes world of Hollywood. From a young age, it was clear that Aisling had inherited that same sharp, analytical mind. She didn't just read stories, she dissected them, looking for the levers of power and influence hidden beneath the prose. By the time she reached her 20s, she had already co-authored a young adult series titled Amber House, a gothic, atmospheric tale filled with family secrets, ancestral estates, and the heavy weight of the past. Looking back, the themes of those books feel almost prophetic, a mirror held up to the very ranch where her own family's blood would eventually be spilled. But the literary world wasn't enough to contain her ambitions. Aisling sought a larger stage. As a student at the University of Southern California, she transformed into a powerhouse of campus politics. She wasn't merely a student, she was a firebrand. An advocate for survivors of sexual assault who wasn't afraid to take on massive institutions with a laptop and a relentless sense of righteousness. She blogged under the name Tucker Reed, building a digital fortress of influence. Her writing was cold, precise, and often devastating. She had a way of framing every conflict as a battle between good and evil, a narrative skill that served her well in the blogosphere but would prove far more dangerous when applied to her own domestic life. Those who knew her during her USC years described her as someone who occupied space with an intense, almost vibrating energy. She was articulate, highly educated, and possessed a vocabulary that she used like a weapon. To her followers, she was a hero. To her detractors, she was a woman who saw herself as untouchable. Someone who believed that as long as she could control the narrative, she could control reality itself. This psychological trait is critical to understanding what came later. Aisling wasn't just living her life, she was performing it. Every blog post, every protest, and every public appearance was a carefully directed scene. However, beneath the shiny veneer of her burgeoning career and her status as a Me Too pioneer, a darker plot was beginning to take root. The academic halls of Los Angeles were a world away from the rugged, sun-bleached hills of Jackson County, Oregon. But the family ties to the Applegate Valley remained unbreakable. The Moores were not just any family in that region, they were landowners. They held a sprawling 160-acre ranch, a piece of dirt that carried both immense financial value and a heavy emotional burden. It was a place of beauty, but it was also a place of isolation. A stage where the family's internal friction could simmer far from the prying eyes of the public. When Aisling returned to the ranch, she didn't leave her Tucker Reed persona behind. She brought the intensity of her activism into the home, focusing her analytical gaze on the family's internal power structures. The ranch wasn't just a home, it was an inheritance, a legacy, and a source of bitter, multi-generational resentment. Her grandmother, Lorene Moore, was the matriarch, but the power was contested. There was her mother, Kelly, and then there was her uncle, Shane Patrick Moore. Shane was in many ways the polar opposite of Aisling. Where she was polished and academic, he was a man of the earth, a person who dealt in the tangible realities of property and physical labor. To Aisling, he wasn't just an uncle, he was an obstacle. A character in her story who refused to follow the script she had written. The friction between them didn't start with a bang. It began with the slow, agonizing grind of legal filings and whispered accusations. Aisling began to document her life at the ranch with the same fervor she had used to document campus scandals. She saw threats everywhere. She began to frame her uncle as a villain, a man whose presence on the property was a literal danger to her and her mother. She didn't just feel unsafe, she intellectualized her fear, building a case against him in her mind and on her digital devices long before a shot was ever fired. She used the language of the law, restraining orders, property rights, and self-defense, to draw a line in the dirt. As the months passed leading up to 2016, the atmosphere at the Applegate Ranch became toxic. The 160 acres that should have been a sanctuary became a pressure cooker. Aisling was no longer just a writer or an activist. She was a woman entrenched in a domestic Cold War. She spent her days navigating the legal complexities of her uncle's rights to the land, her mind constantly whirring, looking for the final act of this family drama. She was convinced that the narrative she was crafting, one of a family under siege by a violent relative, was the only truth that mattered. She had the intellect to justify almost anything, and a sense of self-importance that shielded her from the messy, compromising reality of human emotion. The stage was set. The characters were in place. The brilliant, published author was back in the hills of Oregon, but she wasn't writing fiction anymore. She was living in a world where she believed she was the judge, the jury, and the director of every scene. She had spent years mastering the art of the story, and now she was about to ensure that this particular story ended exactly the way she wanted, regardless of the cost in blood. The Applegate Valley is a place of rugged, haunting beauty, a landscape where the sun-bleached grass meets the dense emerald canopy of the Oregon wilderness. In the heart of this valley sat the Moore family ranch, 160 acres of prime, fertile land that had become the focal point of a psychological war. For most, such a property would be a sanctuary, a place of peace and generational continuity. But for Aisling Tucker Moore Reed and her uncle, Shane Patrick Moore, these acres were a curse. The land wasn't just a physical asset, it was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong between two branches of a family that had forgotten how to speak to one another without the presence of a lawyer. The relationship between Aisling and her uncle was not merely strained. It was a scorched earth conflict fueled by a fundamental disagreement over the future of the estate. Shane, a man who saw the world in tangible terms of value and utility, believed it was time to sell. He looked at the sprawling ranch and saw a financial exit, a way to secure his own future by liquidating his portion of the family's greatest asset. To him, the sentimentality of the dirt was secondary to the practical reality of survival. He felt he was being held hostage by a sister and a niece who refused to see reason, clinging to a legacy that he believed was no longer sustainable. On the other side of the divide, Aisling and her mother, Kelly Moore, viewed Shane's desire to sell as a betrayal of their very identity. Kelly had poured her life into the property, and Aisling, with her novelist's mind, saw the ranch as the setting for her family's grand narrative. To them, Shane wasn't just a relative with a differing opinion, he was an aggressor, an interloper who threatened to strip away their home and their history for the sake of a paycheck. This ideological rift created a vacuum where resentment grew like hemlock in the shade. As 2016 progressed, the tension inside the house on Thompson Creek Road became thick enough to choke on. Aisling began to apply the same analytical, activist-driven framework she had used in the literary world to her own domestic life. She didn't just see a family dispute, she saw a systemic threat. She began to meticulously document every interaction with Shane, framing his frustration as a prelude to violence. She told those around her that her uncle was a volatile presence, a man whose very existence on the property was a physical danger to her and her mother. She spoke of his temper in hushed, urgent tones, building a case that he was the villain in the story she was already writing in her head. The legal escalations were swift and clinical. Aisling sought protection through the courts, filing for a restraining order against her uncle. In her petitions, she described a man who was out of control, claiming that Shane had threatened them and that his presence was a source of constant, debilitating fear. The legal system, designed to handle such disputes with cold objectivity, became another weapon in her arsenal. The restraining order was granted, effectively making Shane a stranger on his own family's land. He was forbidden from coming near his niece, a move that only served to heighten his own sense of injustice. He felt he was being erased from his own heritage by a woman who used her education and her way with words to manipulate the law against him. Shane's frustration wasn't silent. He sought his own legal remedies, attempting to move forward with the sale of the property. The paper war involved endless filings, partition suits, and meetings with mediators that went nowhere. Every time a new document was served, the temperature in the Applegate Ranch rose. Aisling and Kelly retreated further into a siege mentality. They began to treat the ranch like a fortress. They kept the doors locked, the curtains drawn, and their nerves raw. Aisling, ever the documentarian, started keeping her cell phone ready at all times. A digital eye that she hoped would catch Shane in a moment of weakness, providing the smoking gun she needed to banish him forever. Throughout the spring and summer of 2016, the communication between the two sides was reduced to the staccato exchange of legal demands. There were no family dinners, no quiet moments of reconciliation. Instead, there was only the sound of the wind through the pines and the constant, low-frequency hum of anxiety. Shane's mother, Lorene, caught in the middle of her own children's war, was a tragic figure. A woman watching her family disintegrate over the very soil that was supposed to bind them together. She wanted peace. But peace was a commodity that neither Aisling nor Shane was willing to buy at the cost of their pride. Aisling's psychological state during this period was one of hypervigilance. She had convinced herself that a confrontation was inevitable. She didn't just prepare for a fight, she seemed to be beckoning it, waiting for the moment the antagonist would step into the light so she could finally resolve the plot. She wrote about her fear with an intensity that suggested she was already living in a thriller. She viewed herself as a survivor in a house under siege. a role that fit perfectly with her public persona as a defender of the vulnerable. But the line between legitimate fear and narrative construction was becoming increasingly blurred. By July, the situation reached a critical mass. A deal was on the table, a way to finally settle the property dispute and allow both sides to go their separate ways. It involved Shane signing a grant deed that would relinquish his interest in the ranch in exchange for a settlement. It was supposed to be the end of the war, a clinical, bureaucratic conclusion to a year of madness. Shane was expected to arrive at the house to sign the papers, a visit that should have been a simple transaction. But the atmosphere at the ranch that week was anything but simple. Aisling was convinced that Shane wouldn't come in peace. She viewed his arrival not as a step toward resolution, but as an invasion. She began to prepare for his visit not with a pen, but with a mindset of total defense. She told her mother that they needed to be ready for anything, framing the upcoming meeting as a high-stakes climax to their year-long struggle. The air in the kitchen was heavy with the smell of old wood and the metallic tang of unspoken dread. Shane, too, was reaching his limit. He was tired of the labels, tired of the legal barriers, and tired of being treated like a criminal in his own home. He wanted the papers signed so he could finally walk away from the toxicity of the Applegate Ranch. He didn't know that as he drove toward the property that afternoon, he wasn't just walking into a family meeting. He was walking onto a stage that had been meticulously set for a tragedy. He was a man coming to sign a deed, but to the woman waiting inside with a camera and a weapon, he was the monster finally entering the frame. The relationship had devolved into a zero-sum game, where the only way one side could win was for the other to be completely destroyed. The 160 acres of the Applegate Ranch were no longer just land. They were a grave waiting to be filled. A place where the weight of the past was finally going to crush the present. As the sun began to dip behind the Oregon hills on July 26th, the two sides of the Moore family were closer than they had been in months. But the distance between them, psychologically and emotionally, was an unbridgeable chasm. The script was written, the camera was rolling, and the ending was something that no amount of legal filings could ever take back. The morning of July 26, 2016, in the Applegate Valley broke with the kind of stillness that usually signals a reprieve. But inside the house on Thompson Creek Road, the air was vibrating with a specific, jagged energy. This was supposed to be the day the paper war ended. Shane Patrick Moore was scheduled to arrive at the family ranch to sign a grant deed, a legal surrender that would finally untangle the property dispute and allow the two factions of the Moore family to exist in separate worlds. But for Aisling Tucker Moore Reed, this wasn't a bureaucratic conclusion. It was the final act of a high-stakes thriller she had been scoring in her head for months. Aisling didn't just wait for her uncle, she prepared for him with the precision of a director setting a scene. She wasn't just a niece, she was a woman who believed she was under siege. In the hours leading up to the encounter, she ensured her digital defenses were ready. She set her cell phone to record, placing it in a position to capture the kitchen and the door, the stage where the confrontation would inevitably occur. She wanted every word, every gesture, and every perceived threat documented. But she wasn't just armed with a camera. Somewhere within reach was a .22 caliber handgun. As the afternoon heat began to bake the Oregon hills, Shane pulled onto the property. He wasn't alone. He had come with a notary to ensure the signing was legitimate and final. He was a man who wanted out of the legal filings, out of the restraining orders, and out of the toxic atmosphere created by his sister and niece. He walked toward the house, likely unaware that he was walking into a crosshair of both a lens and a barrel. Inside the kitchen were Kelly Moore and the family matriarch, Lorene Moore. The presence of the three generations of women created a formidable, defensive front. The moment Shane stepped into the house, the atmosphere curdled. The recording captured a chaotic, overlapping soundscape of high-pitched anxiety and deep-seated resentment. There was no hello. There was only the immediate, sharp friction of people who had come to loathe the very sound of each other's voices. Aisling's voice, often described as articulate and cold, sliced through the air. She wasn't negotiating, she was reacting to an invasion. Shane, for his part, was there for the papers. He moved toward the table where the documents lay, a physical manifestation of his desire to sever the ties that bound them. The tension in the kitchen reached a fever pitch within seconds. The verbal sparring was frantic. Kelly and Aisling were shouting, telling Shane he wasn't supposed to be there, invoking the restraining order that had turned this family home into a legal minefield. Shane seemed focused on the task, a man trying to finish a chore in a room full of hornets. But to Aisling, his physical presence, the way he moved, the space he occupied, was a direct existential threat. She didn't see an uncle with a pen, she saw a villain who had finally breached the perimeter. Then, the world narrowed to a single violent point. As Shane stood near the kitchen table, Aisling moved. The recording, a piece of evidence that would later haunt the courtroom, captured the chilling progression of the next few heartbeats. There was no long drawn-out struggle. There was no physical assault by Shane. There was only the sudden, sharp report of a single shot. A .22 caliber bullet, small but lethal, left the chamber and struck Shane Patrick Moore in the chest. The sound of the shot didn't bring silence. It brought a different kind of chaos. Shane collapsed, the life beginning to drain out of him onto the floor of the kitchen he had grown up in. But it was Eisling's reaction in the immediate aftermath that would eventually strip away any veneer of tragic accident. On the recording, she didn't sound like a woman gripped by the horror of what she had done. She didn't rush to provide first aid. Instead, her voice remained sharp, focused on the narrative. She screamed at her dying uncle, her words a mixture of rage and a strange, perceived triumph. She told him he wasn't supposed to be there. She spoke as if she were still arguing the legal merits of the restraining order while he bled out at her feet. Outside, the notary, who had witnessed the sudden eruption of violence from just beyond the door, was paralyzed by the reality of what had just happened. The quiet of the Applegate Valley had been shattered by a family's final bloody collapse. Within minutes, the call to 911 was made, but the tone of the house remained surreal. Kelly Moore and Eisling began to frame the incident immediately, their voices captured on the still-running recorder. They spoke of self-defense, of fear, and of the threat Shane had posed. It was as if they were rehearsing the script for the investigators before the sirens even crested the hill. When the first deputies arrived at the Thompson Creek Road Ranch, they found a scene of domestic carnage. Shane was dead. The man who had come to sign away his interest in the land had instead paid for it with his life. Eisling was there, her composure a jarring contrast to the violence of the room. She was the victim, she claimed. She told the officers that her uncle had been aggressive, that he had threatened them, and that she had fired out of a desperate, primal need to protect her mother and grandmother. She used her words, her greatest weapon, to weave a story of a narrow escape from a violent man. The detectives on the scene were met with a complex puzzle. In Oregon, property rights and self-defense laws are potent, and Eisling knew how to navigate those waters. She pointed to the history of conflict, the restraining order, and the fear that had defined her life for the past year. To the initial responders, it looked like a gray area case, a tragic family dispute that had turned fatal under the pressure of a perceived threat. Eisling was emotional but articulate, playing the role of the survivor with a conviction that was hard to ignore. But as Shane's body was removed from the kitchen, a critical piece of the puzzle remained hidden in plain sight. Eisling's cell phone, which had captured the entire incident from start to finish, was taken into evidence. However, she didn't volunteer the password. She didn't tell them that a digital witness had seen everything, the lack of a physical threat, the calculated nature of the shot, and the chilling words she spoke as her uncle died. She relied on the he said, she said nature of domestic violence. Confident that her version of the story, the one where she was the hero defending her home, would be the only one that survived. The Day X of the Moore family didn't end with the shooting. It ended with the beginning of a massive, years-long deception. Eisling walked away from the ranch that day, not in handcuffs, but as a woman who believed she had successfully directed the most difficult scene of her life. She had eliminated the obstacle and protected the land, all while wrapping herself in the protective cloak of the law. She didn't realize that the very technology she used to document her victimhood would eventually become the instrument of her undoing. The 160 acres remained, but the family that had fought over them was gone. Upon in a tale of oneness, one in a grave, and the other beginning a performance that would eventually lead to a very different kind of cage. The sun set over the Applegate Valley, leaving the house on Thompson Creek Road dark and silent, a tomb for a legacy that had been traded for a single .22 caliber bullet. For nearly 2 years, the narrative Eisling Tucker Moore Reed had constructed remained the dominant version of events in Jackson County. She had successfully positioned herself as the survivor of a volatile family tragedy, a woman who had acted out of a desperate, primal need for self-preservation. But while she was on film sets, essentially rehearsing the mechanics of her own crime for the camera, investigators were engaged in a silent, high-stakes battle with a small piece of hardware, her cell phone. This device, confiscated on the day Shane Patrick Moore was killed, had become the ultimate black box of the investigation. The breakthrough did not come from a sudden confession or a new witness, but from the relentless, clinical advancement of digital forensics. For months, the phone had sat in an evidence locker, its contents shielded by encryption that Eisling had stubbornly refused to bypass. She had banked on the technical limitations of local law enforcement, believing that the digital witness to her uncle's death was effectively silenced forever. She was wrong. Specialists eventually cracked the code, and when they did, the story Eisling had been telling the world for years disintegrated in an instant. What they found on the device was a recording, not a short, accidental snippet, but a nearly half-hour-long video that Eisling herself had initiated before Shane even arrived at the house. It was as if she had set a trap and then ensured the trap was well lit and documented. The footage was devastating. It didn't show a woman cornered by a violent aggressor. It showed a calculated, high-tension confrontation where Aisling was the primary engine of the conflict. The audio and video captured the moments leading up to the single fatal shot with a chilling clarity that no courtroom testimony could ever match. The recording revealed that Shane was not attacking anyone. He was standing in the kitchen, attempting to discuss the property deed that would have finally settled the family dispute. The fear that Aisling had described to the initial responders was nowhere to be found in her voice on the tape. Instead, she sounded cold, focused, and increasingly aggressive. The most horrifying revelation, however, came in the seconds immediately following the shooting. As Shane lay dying on the floor, the recording continued to roll. The voice of the woman who would later play a victim in a horror film was heard screaming at her uncle, not in shock but in a strange, visceral fury. She didn't call for help. She didn't attempt to stem the bleeding. She stood over him and continued to berate him, treating his death as a final, victorious argument in their property war. It was a recording of a murder, filmed by the killer herself, who then had the audacity to keep the device as a trophy while claiming innocence to the police. The impact of this evidence on the investigation was immediate and total. The gray area of self-defense vanished. The detectives realized that every interview she had given, every statement her lawyers had made, and every scene she had filmed for From the Dark was part of a massive, systematic deception. She hadn't just killed her uncle, she had attempted to use the very concept of survival to justify a cold-blooded execution over 160 acres of land. In September 2018, the performance finally came to a crashing halt. Aisling was arrested and charged with first-degree manslaughter, which was later upgraded to murder once the full weight of the video evidence was analyzed. The community that had been divided by her story was suddenly united in shock as the details of the recording leaked out. The method actress was no longer a rising star or a literary activist. She was a defendant facing the reality of a life sentence. Even as she sat in a jail cell, the irony continued to spiral. The independent film From the Dark was nearing completion, and the producers were faced with a moral and legal nightmare. Their lead actress was a real-life killer who had potentially used her experience of committing a murder to enhance her performance of one on screen. The lines between reality and fiction had not just blurred, they had been completely erased by a woman who viewed the world as a script she could rewrite at will. The investigation moved from the digital world back to the physical reality of the ranch. Detectives re-examined the ballistics and the layout of the kitchen with the benefit of the video's perspective. Everything Aisling had said was a lie. The positioning of the body, the distance from which the shot was fired, and the lack of any defensive wounds on her or her family members painted a picture of a pre-planned attack. She had waited for the right moment, ensured the camera was rolling, and then pulled the trigger on a man who had come to her house with a pen, not a weapon. The lost cell phone had finally spoken, and its testimony was irrefutable. Aisling Tucker Moore Reid's greatest work wasn't a novel or a blog post. It was a 20-minute digital file that documented her own descent into madness and murder. As the trial date approached in 2020, the woman who had spent her life crafting images of herself was finally forced to look at the one image she couldn't manipulate, the reflection of a killer caught in her own lens. By early 2020, the grand narrative Aisling Tucker Moore Reid had carefully curated for herself finally collapsed under the weight of her own digital footprint. The self-defense defense, which she had maintained with the poise of a seasoned lead, was no longer tenable against the chilling reality of the kitchen recording. In a move that signaled the end of her public performance, she accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to second-degree manslaughter. The first-degree murder charges were dropped, a legal concession that left her uncle's side of the family feeling that justice had been edited down for time. The judge handed down a sentence of 75 months in state prison. It was a clinical conclusion to a saga defined by literary flair and domestic blood. As she was led away, the horror film From the Dark stood as a grim testament to her life's work. A movie where she played a killer, filmed by a woman who already was one. She had spent a lifetime seeking the spotlight. She found it in a prison cell. The 160 acres of the Applegate Ranch still sit under the Oregon sun. Indifferent to the bloodshed for their possession, Aisling sought to be a master of narrative. But she forgot that reality doesn't have an editor to trim the incriminating parts. She is now just another number in the Oregon Department of Corrections, a storyteller silenced by her own recording. In the end, the method wasn't about acting at all. It was the sound of a family collapsing in the quiet hills, leaving nothing behind but shadows and cold, digital truth. If you are finished watching, you're a real true crime fan. Subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. See you in the next video.